This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. 14 candidates for mayor of Chicago. Now we're down to 2 after last night's election, last night's election results. And every single one of the 14 supported marijuana legalization.
Yep.
Newly minted Governor Spalding, one of his first priorities, marijuana legalization. Obviously, government at every level and in other states as well sees this as a revenue generator so that they don't have to make difficult decisions about how to finance government in some sustainable way.
What are fund pensions?
Make difficult decisions about what government should be and should not be in the business of doing. The live within the means discussion they don't want to have. And so I was interested in the last few weeks, and we talked about this topic a couple weeks back, by a couple of pieces. One was this piece by Alex Berenson, who's a former New York Times reporter, in Imprimis, which is the publication that Hillsdale College puts out. Another was, interestingly, in the Wall Street Journal, from a pulmonary physician at Sloan Kettering in New York. His piece, the Wall Street Journal piece, "If Weed is Medicine, So is Budweiser," where he argues, just the science, frankly, because he's actually, and this is sort of interesting, he actually indicates he's a proponent of legalizing marijuana for recreational use, but he nonetheless wants people to understand it's a toxin, it's not medicine. Berenson's piece is much more in depth, and it's intriguing because there's a movement on the position with respect to legalization by Mr. Berenson, as he describes, in part, I think, through the influence his wife had, who is a psychiatrist at a psychiatric institute in New York. And this has prompted a book as well. The book by Alex Berenson is Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And so we now turn to Alex Berenson to get some of the straight dope on marijuana legalization. Alex Berenson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
One of the, there was a lot that was really interesting about your essay in Imprimis, but just I think the starting point is this sentence: almost everything you think you know about the health effects of cannabis, almost everything advocates in the media have told you for a generation is wrong. So that's a pretty big statement that covers a lot of areas. So you tell me where you want to begin on that topic.
Sure. So first of all, the Wall Street Journal piece is correct. Marijuana is not medicine. We don't say alcohol is medicine, even though alcohol can reduce your blood pressure, and for some people it seems to reduce the risk of heart attacks. It's not medicine, right? It's a recreational intoxicant, and it's addictive, and it causes problems for some people, even though a lot of people can use it without problems. And that's exactly true of marijuana. Most of the claims made about marijuana's medicinal properties are not true in the public, in the media. There's a couple things that THC, which is the compound in marijuana, chemical in marijuana that gets you high, have actually been shown to be good for. If you have chemotherapy and you have nausea, THC is good for that, although there are other drugs that are also good for that. And there's some evidence that marijuana can reduce pain, at least in the short term, although the evidence is not as strong as people think. It probably reduces pain for the same reason that, if you have a toothache and you take a shot of whiskey, you feel a little bit better. It just sort of dulls your it's an intoxicant, so it dulls your feeling of pain. But in the long run, there's actually pretty good evidence. There's a very good study from last year from Australia showing that people who had chronic pain, marijuana for most people doesn't actually treat, and they wind up, if they were taking opioids before, they wind up taking more opioids. So marijuana is not medicine. Let's get that out of the way. Now, the legalization community in the last 20 years has been really, really smart and savvy, and they've promoted it as medicine. And Americans tend to be, to my mind, pretty fair people. And when you say to them, well, if I'm dying of cancer or I'm dying of HIV, I should be allowed to smoke pot if it makes me feel better, people say, I get that, I understand that. And they've tended to vote, in states that have an initiative process in favor of legalizing medicinal marijuana, not realizing what the advocacy community knows, which is that most of the people who go out and get these authorizations, because it's not a prescription, you don't get a prescription for medical marijuana, you get an authorization from a doctor who most of the time is just in the business of writing these authorizations. Most of the people who get these authorizations are not people with cancer or people with HIV or people with ALS. They're people who were smoking pot before, and they want to smoke with a license, and they want to be able to go to a dispensary and buy legally. So this is the great myth of medicinal marijuana, and I agree with Peter Bach in the Wall Street Journal. If we're going to legalize this stuff, and I don't favor legalization, but there's a case to be made for legalization. If we're going to legalize it, let's not pretend that it's medicine. Let's say it's a recreational drug, and let's legalize it on that basis, and then let's talk about how we're going to tell people about its problems.
Well, can marijuana cause schizophrenia?
Yes, marijuana is a psychiatrically toxic drug. Marijuana causes psychosis. That's the term that doctors, psychiatrists use for a break from reality. So if you smoke or you take an edible and you wind up in the emergency room with hallucinations or just you're having a panic attack and you think the cops are out to get you, people wind up in the ER all the time for these symptoms. You're going to be diagnosed with what's called cannabis psychosis. That's a medical term. And if you smoke a lot as a teenager, your risk of getting schizophrenia, which is a really terrible mental illness that's essentially a permanent psychotic condition, are somewhere between 2 and 6 times the risk of somebody who doesn't smoke. And again, schizophrenia is a terrible disease, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And the fact that we're close to legalizing a drug nationally that can do this to people without even really realizing this risk is incredible to me.
And I just go back to, I mentioned at the outset, but your wife was a senior psychiatrist at this institute in New York, and she was, it seems to me, one of the people that opened your eyes to this piece of the discussion.
She did, and she would say to me, this guy was smoking. He killed his mother with an axe, or this person was smoking, and she threw her kids off a roof. I mean, these are real cases. I'm not exaggerating the kind of violence that you see when people get psychotic. These are the terrible things that people do. And I said to her, Jackie, this sounds like reefer madness. This sounds like nonsense. And she said, well, you should go look at what the science says. And of course, she's the doctor. She's the one who sees the cases. She's the one who's read the studies. So of course I should have listened to her. And ultimately, when I did listen to her and I read the studies, and I used to be an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and I covered the drug industry, so I know a little bit about this stuff. I was shocked how strong the science is on this.
One of the other things that you make mention of in your piece, just in terms of informing people as to what the reality on the ground is, as compared to the caricature and the marketing by pro-legalization interests. This marijuana that's legal in Colorado, for example, this isn't your hippie parents' Woodstock marijuana.
No, it's not. It's incredibly strong. It's 20 to 30% THC in a lot of cases. The stuff that was smoked in the late 60s or early 70s was 1 to 2% THC in most cases. So you can see that's 10 times or more as strong. And a lot of people today, because marijuana is addictive, because people develop a tolerance to it, they wind up using essentially what is a pure THC extract from the plant. It doesn't look like what you think of as marijuana. It's this sort of waxy substance that you smoke. And the idea that this is in any way medicinal is even more of a joke. By the way, you mentioned the tax issues, and of all the reasons to legalize, the idea that this is going to be a significant revenue raiser is the absolute worst. Okay, if you want to legalize on social justice issues, or you want to say I'm a libertarian and people should be allowed to make their own mistakes, that's fine. But even in Colorado, which is the state that has, I believe, the highest per capita use and also has some cannabis tourism still, marijuana taxes account for less than 1% of the state budget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But how has the number of aggravated assaults and murders gone up in places like Colorado, places like Alaska, Washington, and Oregon?
Sure. So because schizophrenia, unfortunately, is a very serious contributor to violence. So people with schizophrenia but they have a much higher risk for violence than people who are healthy. They have about a 20 times risk of homicide. And I'm sure, without thinking too hard, you can think of terrible cases in Chicago where the person was clearly mentally ill, where the perpetrator was clearly mentally ill. So when you legalize a substance that encourages or that tends to produce psychosis and schizophrenia, you are raising the risk of violence in the people who are becoming ill. And in Colorado, in Alaska, in Washington, in Oregon, those four states were the first four to legalize. In 2013, they had about 450 murders. They had about 30,000 aggravated assaults. In 2017, which is the most recent full data we have, they had about 620 murders and 38,000 aggravated assaults. So the numbers went up about 40% for murders. That's much faster than the national average. Now, I know Chicago has a severe violence problem. A lot of that problem is undoubtedly linked to drug dealing, especially cannabis dealing. It's clear nationally that low-level marijuana dealing accounts for a significant fraction of all the homicides committed in the United States. And you can find increasingly police talking about this. Now, the legalizers are going to say, okay, well, let's legalize and we'll move all that black market dealing into the regulated market. Unfortunately, the experience of states like Colorado shows that doesn't happen at all because, first of all, people under 21 can't buy legally, so they still have to buy in the black market. And second of all, the legal market has taxes and it has regulations. And so the price is often higher in the legal market than in the black market. This is not alcohol where when you legalize, you end the black market. You just set up a community of people who have a financial interest in promoting this drug's use and who are making slickly produced ads and who are having dispensaries and who are marketing to young adults. The legalization, the way the United States has done it, is the worst of all worlds right now.
And I just want to be clear, too, on the science. What we're talking about here with the onset of psychosis and then crimes committed by people that are suffering, for example, from schizophrenia, there's correlations here. There's not a direct causal link.
Well, so I would say there's a direct causal link between schizophrenia and violence. That doesn't mean everybody who becomes schizophrenic is going to commit violence. I would say if you look at the statewide data, we can't say right now that cannabis legalization has driven up those violence rates. We don't know. There's a lot of reasons violence can rise and fall in a state. But what I will tell you is the people who promoted legalization said, hey, this is going to give the cops a chance to bust murderers instead of pot smokers. This is going to eliminate the black market. This is going to reduce violence once you legalize. And that has proven to be completely untrue. And, again, in cities that have severe underlying violence problems like Chicago, like Detroit, like Washington, D.C., I think there's a real danger that legalization will pour gasoline on the fire. And, we don't know yet. It's too early to tell, but what we can say is that legalization has definitely not reduced violent crime in states that legalize.
Now, the flip side is, although I think this is going to be one of these, we're still very much in the early stages of this. It could change culturally. Norms change over time and generations. But another interesting point you make in your essay is that usage has not increased in terms of the number of people. It's just increased by the number of people who were already using.
So usage has increased. The number of Americans who use has increased in the last 15 years. It's risen from about 25 million to 40 million. So it's gone up.
Okay.
But what's more striking is that the number of people who use daily has gone up much faster. So the number of people who use daily about 15 years ago was about 3 million. Now it's closer to 9 million. So it's almost tripled. What legalization seems to do, because this is an addictive substance, like alcohol, like opioids, some people who start using it are going to develop a problem with it, and they're going to use it heavily. And, the notion of what, is actually called the wake and baker is a real thing. These people who literally are high on THC all day, every day. And legalization, because it reduces the price and because it increases availability, makes it much easier for those people to satisfy their habit. And that's clearly the most dangerous kind of use. I mean, that's true of any drug. anybody who's using alcohol morning to night has a problem with alcohol. And, those people they're more obvious than people who are using THC morning to night because alcohol has more, obvious physical effects. But I think that everybody would agree that that's not a good, healthy pattern of use.
He is Alex Berenson, as he mentioned. He's a former New York Times investigative reporter covering the drug industry. The essay at imprimis.hillsdale.edu is Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. The book is Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And as you heard from Alex, there's a lot of information here.
Thank you so much. I just would like to say one last thing.
Sure.
I hope whatever people think about legalization, I really did write this book so that people could talk to their kids. And, people who are using it might have a problem with the drug or be worried about whatever psychiatric side effects they're seeing could sort of put this in context. And, I know that there's just a lot of misinformation out there, and I hope the book can help with that.
Alex, thank you so much, and good luck with the book. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.